Dear students, welcome to week 3. In the first module under week 3, we take up human rights provisions in the United Nations Charter. I will briefly tell you the context in which the UN Charter was adopted, the human rights provisions in the United Nations Charter, and also the critique of those provisions. Now, in the World War I and World War II, there were serious violations, particularly in Hitler's Germany. There were gas chambers, concentration camps, and there was ethnic cleansing of a large scale. In fact, a new word had to be coined to describe that phenomenon, and that's how genocide was came into being. And chastened by these horrors of world wars, the international community met at a conference in San Francisco. The conference was titled as a Conference on International Organization, and at the end of that conference, the United Nations Charter was signed on 26 June 1945, and it came into force on 24th October 1945. And in that UN Charter itself, you find the statute of the International Court of Justice incorporated. Now, if you look at the preamble of the United Nations Charter, there is a clear affirmation that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And it goes on to say that and affirm the faith in the fundamental human rights and freedoms for all without distinctions of race, language, religion, etc. And it also talks about the need to ensure justice and freedom. And if you look at Article 1 of the UN Charter, which talks about the purposes of the United Nations, there is a clear mention about international peace and security, development, and in the third purpose is ensuring human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to gender, race, language, religion. And these are the purposes for which all member countries are supposed to work for. And Article 13 talks about the UN General Assembly's mandate, particularly with regard to the codification of international law, with regard to the work of United Nations. And Article 55 also talks about the need to ensure universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Article 56 says that all countries, either singly or in collaboration with other countries, advance the aims of the United Nations, particularly mentioned in Article 55 of the United Nations Charter. Today, if a terrible thing is happening in one corner of the world, it is a matter of genuine concern to the rest of the humanity. Why is it so? It's because all countries of the world have signed the United Nations Charter. All countries of the world have pledged to undertake either alone or in collaboration with others to advance the aims of the United Nations, which include the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. And in the United Nations Charter, you will find the roles and responsibilities of the different principal organs. And Article 62 talks about the establishment of the Economic and Social Council to carry out work entrusted to it. And there are references to the codification of international law, particularly in human rights law, and also convening of conferences, and also working for economic, social, cultural, educational and other advancement of the member nations. Article 68 says the Economic and Social Council shall set up functional commissions to carry out its mandate, and in pursuance of that Article 68, ECOSOC set up the Commission on Human Rights, which is now replaced by the Human Rights Council, and it also established earlier on Subcommission for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights, now known as Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. And Commission on the Status of Women is yet another important functional commission established by the ECOSOC to carry on its mandate, and which has a high relevance to the work of the human rights. And ECOSOC consists of 54 members, and they also work closely with non-governmental organizations and to advance the human rights. The General Assembly is the main deliberative body, and where all countries of the world are members, and each one having a vote, and there is no restriction on the its mandate, and it can discuss all aspects related to human rights and make recommendations for the advancement of human rights, and also for codification of international human rights law. Now, we have seen the historical context in which the UN Charter was adopted. We have also seen briefly the elements of the United Nations Charter, and particularly how its some of its principal organs have or undertake a role relation to the human rights. Now, let us look at a critique of those provisions. In fact, there are scholars who find that the references to human rights in the UN Charter are scattered, very terse, and they're unhappy with the lack of detailed references to the protection and promotion of human rights in the United Nations Charter. The second major objection to the United Nations Charter is about the language that has been used to refer to the human rights provisions, and the language takes the nature of a promotional. It says all states are encouraged, all states pledge, and human rights, as you know, are burning issues which require sustained, coordinated and calibrated action. On the other hand, the references in the UN Charter talk about promotional aspects, whereas it should have been more binding, more stringent, more rigorous protection should have been there. Yet, the UN Charter represents a significant milestone in the efforts to secure human rights for all. In fact, there was a strong demand that it should have a Bill of Rights as a part of the UN Charter, but yet many countries did not agree. As a result, the development of a International Bill of Rights was left out of the UN Charter, and it was entrusted to the ECOSOC and UN General Assembly, and subsequently you find that the International Bill of Rights was adopted, starting with a Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and the optional protocols to the ICCPR in the year 1966. Thus, in substance, UN Charter was a major milestone in the history and evolution of human rights, and right in the preamble and also right in the purposes of United Nations in Article 1, you find a clear reference to the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms.